My guest today is Mark Mercer, Professor of Philosophy, President of Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship. Mark's given public lectures on free speech and has written many journal articles and news articles. Mark recently presented a talk on the academic irrelevance of lived experience. We talk about the rise in preferential hiring around the country, whether lived experience is important for academic positions, the slow demise of liberal studies, and why a true intellectual should not ever be offended by ideas. You can find more information on Mark by going to www.professormarkmercer.ca. And if you are a free speech proponent, I highly recommend becoming a member of the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship. All the links are in the show notes and on the Kazingram Dialogue website. So now, please welcome my friend Mark Mercer to the Kazingram Dialogue. Ladies and gentlemen, Mark Mercer. Hi, Mark. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, IJ.
How are you doing?
I'm quite well, thank you.
Yeah,
doing very well.
You're sipping a glass of wine just now. What are you sipping? Is that anything fancy?
No, it's nothing fancy, and it's just grape juice.
Just
cranberry grape.
I was expecting something much more exciting than that. How's the semester for you been?
Oh, it's good. It's been very hectic. Lots of things happening. I'm teaching only the one course, the critical thinking course, and I think it's going well. But as you know, with that course, there are a lot of students who have difficulties. So I've been holding extra sessions.
Okay, you're not teaching any upper year philosophy classes?
No.
Are you working on a book project?
Yes. I'm
Are you allowed to talk about it?
Well, more than one, unfortunately. I am doing the critical thinking text now because I've been teaching the course for so long.
Yeah.
And I have notes and exercises, so I'm just going to put them together, and I think I'll try it out next year on the class, and then ship it to publishers if it manages to work.
Okay.
So that's one thing I'm working on. Also, a introduction to philosophy textbook that I've been working on for years and years. Whenever I get a chance to teach a lower level philosophy course, I'll try to work on one of the chapters. So I hope to have it finished maybe by the end of the summer.
End of this summer?
Yeah, maybe not. Things take a while, but my intention is to have a draft of my critical thinking book ready for September, and to have something like a penultimate draft of the introductory textbook ready.
Okay. And do you have a publisher, or how? I don't know how it works.
Well, yes, that's how people who go about these things better than I do it. They find publishers and will shop a prospectus, get feedback from the publisher, whether it's the sort of thing the publisher wants.
Right.
But I've been using these chapters in courses I've been teaching. I taught a half-year introduction to philosophy course last semester. Not last semester, last year. And I used the chapters from my textbook. I've used chapters from the textbook in other courses, and one of my colleagues used it once in a course he was teaching. So I think it's been worked around a few times, and I think if I just finish it up, I should be able to interest some publishers in it. But no, it was I made it in order that I could use it to teach. Mm-hmm. And now that it's in rough, ready shape, I think I'll see about publishers. But really, that's the wrong way to go about it. You should approach the publisher with an idea. Right. Debate the idea with the publisher. The publisher has some ideas about what you should do, and then you get a contract and length of time, and then you submit it.
I see. Does this reverse way make it more difficult? Will it make it more difficult for you?
To get it published?
Yeah, having written it.
I don't know. I don't expect so. I've been writing it for my own use, and so now I'll just see if anyone wants to take it.
Okay, that's interesting. Is this have you written in the book before this?
No, my wife Sophie, she's written a book. Right. I haven't written a book.
So you've got someone in the household that can.
That's right. We already have a published book in the house, but I'm going to. I hope to get something done. But more strictly philosophically, I'm working on a paper on formalizing, or at least trying to understand, practical reasoning.
Okay.
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Well, you're familiar with Aristotle's practical syllogism, of course, which the conclusion is an action, and I don't think that makes much sense. The conclusion would have to be a proposition, perhaps the representation of an intention. But what I don't think works in most accounts of practical reasoning is bringing the preferences and values and desires into the structure of the syllogism itself. In Aristotle, one of the premises would be something like dry food is good. Mm-hmm. Right, so an evaluative premise, and you need a desire for there to be an intention, for there to be an action, but I don't think that has propositional form. I think when we're reasoning what to do, we're entirely within the realm of beliefs and not in the realm of values. I think values provide a background, and they make things salient for us. Okay. So I want to develop these ideas. I think. Elizabeth Anscombe had a similar view, but she didn't. She sort of hinted at it in places in her book Intention, but didn't fully formulate it. So I want to work it out. Okay,
so have you read her stuff before, the big Intention book?
Oh, it's a short Intention book.
Oh, Anscombe, what am I thinking of?
Book Intention is pretty short. I think it's fewer than 100 pages.
Oh, I'm thinking of Eleanor Stump. She has
yes,
Aquinas. That's right. Different person. Okay.
Yes.
So had you read?
I've read a lot of Anscombe over the years.
I was actually learning about Anscombe, and there was three other women that she was closely tied with at Oxford, and how they were like the four women who were taught by the traditionalists, because the men had gone to the war, and then when they came back, it was like the old ideas versus the new ideas. It was her versus Ayres. It's very interesting little interview that one of the four women who had survived, or I think may have just passed away, she was kind of talking about it.
Flip a Foot and Mary Midgley.
Mary Midgley, that's her name. Mary Midgley became an author, right?
Well, she wrote. Maybe you're thinking of Iris Murdoch, who became a fiction writer.
Okay.
As a philosopher, but Mary Midgley wrote essays, lots of them, and collected them in volumes. But I don't think she ever wrote fiction.
Okay.
Iris Murdoch.
Okay.
Best known for her novels.
She was a philosopher.
Yeah.
Okay.
She wrote philosophy now and then, but. Best known for her novels.
Okay. So do you find that? So I've read quite a few of the letters that you, as the president of Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship, you write these letters to universities who are who have, I guess, preferential hiring.
Yes. Yeah.
Where they'll be like, okay. So most recently was the Dalhousie had a hiring position for math professor,
right?
But the qualifier was that they had to be Aboriginal or racially visible. And you've written a letter, and you've written quite a few of these letters before. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to get your thought. Okay, so usually when you write these letters, you'll say, academic hiring should not be based on how you look, I guess. It should be based on your academic standards, your quality. But they always respond with the same
academic criteria. That academic decisions should be made on academic criteria alone, And then if we want to get into conversation, we might qualify that a bit by saying, well, sometimes academic criteria run out, and but only then should one turn to non-academic criteria. And we think that race, sex, sexual orientation, ability status, all these things are non-academic criteria.
And why do you think that's becoming more of a qualifying section for these hirings? Because Dalhousie's had a few, I believe.
Yes.
Out at UBC has. Why is it becoming more of a thing where they're always qualifying?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure why. I suspect it's something like the desire that the professoriate resembles the general population, right? So if the general population is
students, you mean, or
of Canadians generally. So
I see.
I don't know what the percentages are, but let's say Aboriginal Canadians, First Nation Canadians are 5-8% of the Canadian population. I'm not sure, so somewhere around there. So the goal then is to have 5 to 8% of university professors identify as Aboriginal.
Okay.
First Nation Canadian. Why? I'm not entirely sure. There should absolutely be no unfairness in hiring, and if there are people from some identifiable group who are qualified and applying in numbers and yet are being hired in much lower numbers, well, there's a serious problem. It must be that there's some bias or prejudice against people of that group. But as long as procedural fairness is in place, is followed, then we don't think that the percentages or the numbers is particularly relevant. Now, there are some worries here too, and that's that, for instance, some of the groups that are now favored in directed hirings are, even if their percentage in the general population, say 5 to 8%, they're making up maybe 1 or 2% at most of doctoral students, of people who have the basic qualifications for the positions. And if universities are going to be competing with each other for this very small pool, then that can create resentments and problems generally. So we think it's a bad idea for any number of reasons, but primarily because we think that a university functions best when it does what a university should be doing, and a university does what it should be doing when university decisions are made on academic criteria.
And do these universities, when these letters are written, do they respond well? Do they end up changing the criteria or do they just give?
No, we often get a response, but the response will just reiterate that the university will not hire anyone who is not qualified, that it's important for the for university policies for inclusion and diversity that there be targeted hirings. So we do that. Sometimes we get arguments that verge on academic arguments. The most common is the professor as role model. So women students will do better and be more intrigued in the subject if they're taught by a female rather than a male.
Is this quantified?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if there are studies that would indicate that or not. Our response, of course, is that, well, you want to hire people who are good teachers, and that will come out in the interviewing process and when candidates are asked to teach a mock class. There needn't be a pre-selection in favor of members of a particular group in order to find the best teacher for the students on your campus. And sometimes I talk about what's called lived experience, and it's not always clear just what that is.
Right.
If there is this thing, lived experience, and it does have academic significance, then certainly it would come out in the research and the teaching of the person who possesses it. That is, their research or teaching would be better as research or teaching by virtue of their lived experience. So again, all we need to look at is the research and the teaching. If the lived experience is relevant, it's relevant because it manifests itself in the teaching or the research. So it's sort of like, they say that travel broadens your mind. So put a lot of stickers on your luggage so that people know that your mind has been broadened. No, you talk to the person, and that's where you discover that this person is so much more interesting than other people because of the travel he or she has made. Same with lived experience. If lived experience is relevant, well, it's going to come out in what really matters, the research and the teaching. So there's no need to make it a criterion for application to a scholarship or to a position.
Because there was that case, I believe it was last year, and this professor was going to teach Aboriginal history, and
Well, Mount St. Vincent University.
Okay, so yes. So what happened with that? What exactly? She was going to teach a history course, but they said, or he, I think it was a she.
Oh, she, yeah.
Okay.
Her name escapes me right now. I could find it quite easily. But anyway, there was very little there. It was I was somewhat disturbed by the disingenuity of Mount St. Vincent, the university. Anyway, what happened was there's a member of the history department, tenure track, I think, perhaps tenured, I'm not sure. But at any rate, she's a permanent member of the history department. She had designed a course on the history of the residential schools. She's an historian, and one of her fields of expertise is Aboriginal history and the history of the residential schools. So this is work that in the course she was going to be drawing on her own research and a field that she knows very well. So eminently capable of teaching this course. But it turned out that there were one or two very small number of people who raised it as as for them a serious issue that a course on the residential schools wasn't being taught by someone of First Nations heritage, who identified as First Nations Canadian. Now, that should have been the end of it. The history department and Mount St. Vincent would say, well, this course was assigned to this professor through the regular channels in the usual way, and it's her course to teach. But and they couldn't have done anything. I mean, they couldn't have said, no, you can't teach the course or whatever. That would have violated the collective agreement, the ways in which universities staff their courses. But at any rate, the president and academic vice president of the university convened a meeting to discuss this.
Okay.
Now, they gave every impression that this meeting would be a meeting to determine whether this professor would teach the course or someone else would teach the course, but that could not have been what the meeting was. I mean, that was just not an option. And the chair of the history department had said, no, the professor who's been assigned the course will be teaching the course. So it was sort of a meeting for show to sort of indicate that they are taking these concerns seriously. And that was sad that the university and the CBC and other news organizations took the meeting to be one about determining who is going to be teaching this course, because that's how the university had represented it, even though they hadn't actually said that, because it would have been false. But yes, in the end, she taught the course as she had planned, as the university had assigned her.
Mm-hmm.
And yet at the same time, the university made a fuss about not having enough Aboriginal or First Nations Canadian scholars on staff. And the suggestion was this would have been a better course, a better pedagogical experience for the students had the professor been First Nations Canadian. So they trying to make that point. And again, no, it's the quality of the research, the quality of the teaching that matters.
And it seems like it comes back down to the lived experience, right? Because presumably the Aboriginal professor would have had lived experience, and perhaps
lived experience of what? Residential school? It's probably not. Maybe a family member who's has some who attended a residential school. Maybe not. It's more. I mean, there are some ideas that I think are false that get floated around, and that's if you're a member of some community, identified community, then the knowledge of the experiences of other members of that community becomes your knowledge.
Right.
And I don't think that's always the case. One can hear from any number of sources what happened. And yet, as a scholar, one's going to be critical, one's going to investigate, one's going to check things out for oneself and come to one's own conclusions. So one of the points I tried to make when we had our little conference on lived experience and other things is that lived experience is at best raw material for a scholar. And it doesn't matter whether it's one's own or someone else's.
Okay.
What the scholar does is interrogate it, ask it questions, ask of the lived experience, whether it's vertical, whether how it fits with other things that one believes, theorize about it. The lived experience is at best where a scholar begins. It's not, an end point of scholarship.
Okay, so you would be in complete disagreement with people saying that if you're not Aboriginal or if you're not Asian, if you're not Black, then you can't write from their perspective. So I don't
know that there is a perspective to write from.
As in, like, if you're a storyteller, say you're a storyteller and you're writing a story,
use your imagination, make your characters whomever.
Right, and so these people would say, "Oh, if Mark, you're white, you can't write these. You can't pretend to be, someone from the ghetto, even though you may know someone from the ghetto and you've talked to them." So I believe it was on CBC a year ago, about this woman had written a book, or maybe a man, either or.
Man?
They had written a book, and it was from it was about the indigenous people, or like one of the indigenous groups, and they had mentioned it in their book. So when it came out, the publisher got criticism from certain indigenous groups and certain other groups, saying that this person, is white and they shouldn't be able to write our lived experiences. Yeah. And to me, it was very strange because, story is a story. It doesn't matter that it was written by a Greek or someone from southern China. It's still a story. So it seems kind of strange that we would have this complaint.
Yeah.
So when it comes to the scholarship, it seems even stranger because you're in university. These are professors. They've done their due diligence, gone to school. You would expect that, especially say as a historian, that you'd be critical enough to. Everyone comes with some sort of bias. Nobody disagrees with that.
Well, I might. I'm not sure what bias is. People come with preferences.
Sure.
All of them are biases.
But like some sort of some sort of preference, right?
Yeah, there's things that matter to me that don't matter to others. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Like your like free speech matters to you a lot, and for some people it doesn't matter. Free speech out the door. But like as a historian, you would expect that she was more than capable to teach Aboriginal history. I don't even know why there was criticism, or like not criticism, but like there was.
Well, yeah, I think that the idea might be that scholarship should take a back seat to other matters. And
That's so strange.
Well, I at a university, yes. I think, yeah, if you're in a fire department, yeah, scholarship takes a back seat to whatever we're doing and trying to put out the fire. But there are political or social concerns that come to the fore and crowd out scholarship, or allowed to crowd out scholarship. And these might be things like validating certain accounts, the accounts given by the appointed or self-appointed spokespeople for certain groups, as a way of trying to bring the concerns of that group into the mainstream. One of the thoughts is that rather than a course in the history of the residential schools, a scholarly course on history of the residential schools, this would be a course that inspires allegiance to those who were harmed by the residential schools, and concern to alleviate the plight of marginalized people, or people from historically oppressed groups. And to that extent, one might say, well, we need a spokesperson from the affected group in order to have the most political or social effect in alleviating the plight of people from marginalized groups, right? So the scholarship is not as important. This isn't a. I mean, what does one do when one's taking a history course? Well, one's learning how to react intelligently to the past, learning how to react to the past as a historian does, coming to be something of a historian. But that's not the only thing that might be happening in a classroom. Other things that might be happening in a classroom is engendering sympathy for those who've been victimized. And that might be, the main goal of a particular course, rather than helping students to become historians.
Has this always been the case, or has it just become worse as the years have gone on? The idea.
Well, you'll have to ask a historian. I don't know.
But like you've been teaching for what, 20 years or so?
Yeah,
maybe
closer to 30.
Closer, man.
Closer to 30. Yeah, I started.
Jeez, Mark, I didn't know you were that old.
Oh, I started teaching when I was doing my doctorate.
So, like, did you?
Well, no, I think we're coming around. There have always been two traditions at least two traditions in universities, and one is the tradition that inspires me the most. It's the tradition I identify with. It's the tradition I think is sometimes under siege, and it's a tradition I don't think is well understood. And I call it the tradition of liberal study.
Okay.
And the idea, pardon me? Oh yeah, the idea is that we want to investigate things to understand how things in themselves are, how the things are. Now, not all university research is into the ways of the world. Sometimes we're interpreting, sometimes we're appraising, but there as well, the goal is simply to understand things as best one can. But the goal is also to come to one's beliefs and one's theories for one's own good reasons, and not as a result of social pressures, not as a result of desires you have for a better world, or fears you have for a worse world. It's this is the scholar's calling. But alongside that tradition, there's always in universities been another tradition, and this tradition's usually the majority tradition at the university. And that's the idea of preparing students to take their positions in the professional and managerial worlds. Part of that means the skills of the manager and the professional, but it also means having the right attitudes, the attitudes of finding a way to help people, help society generally through one's own endeavors, having the right values. Now, in North America, and I think in Europe too, for many centuries and right into the 60s and 70s, most universities were affiliated with religious groups, and other universities were affiliated with the military. And so there was this set of values, extra academic values, non-academic values about the role of citizenship, about the nature of a good society and the like. And those values circumscribed what happened at the university. So scholarship could take place, but only within the ambit of these values. So for instance, at some religious schools, questioning, say, the nature of God, the doctrine came first. And one could examine things only so far as that doctrine was held firmly. Now, I think what's happened is we're coming back to that, except it's not religion anymore. It's not the military. It's not like the agricultural schools. It's more that the goal is to ensure that people from historically oppressed or marginalized groups have access to positions in the managerial and professional ranks. It's that students generally have the right values, right, often including diversity, inclusion, sustainability, these sorts of things. Now, this is a very common and very old conception of the university, even though the values are somewhat different than the universities of the 40s and 50s and prior to that. And so the second tradition, the minority tradition that I mentioned, the tradition of liberal study, has always been there, but I think it's always been a minority tradition, and it's often under siege and often under threat. And so one of my tasks is to try to articulate this other idea of the university and heighten the contrasts between this idea of the university and what institutional arrangement should be for this university to function, and the other conception of the university, the other ethos, and what needs to be there. So I sometimes put it this way, there are two ways in which humans come to believe what we believe and value what we value what we value. On the one hand, there's evidence and argument. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, on one hand, evidence and argument. On the other hand, social pressures, the reward and punishment, fear of exclusion, desire to be included. You can come to believe something not because you have evidence that's the way it is, but because you like the people who believe it and you want to be one of them. And I think that the techniques that universities use, like speech codes and codes of student conduct and the call-out culture, where people are shamed for espousing the wrong views, these are ways of applying pressure to get people to believe one way rather than another and value one way rather than another. Whereas at a university of scholarship, a university of liberal study, the attempt would always be to use evidence and argument only and to leave people be free from pressures to make up their own minds.
So is the call-out culture, it reminds me, because you know how you're talking about the values have changed, but they're still functioning under a similar structure. Is that so? The call-out culture, if you're not espousing the prevailing view, it almost seems like you're the heretic, like within using religious terminology. If you're not espousing orthodoxy, then you're burnt on a metaphorical stake, right? As a heretic,
and bring you back into the fold that way.
Right. And is it from, as a professor, do you think it's getting worse, where the university is becoming less and less, I guess, liberal in less of a liberal arts?
Yeah, no, I think so. I think liberal study is less understood and less valued by university people these days than it was in the past. Even though it's always been a minority culture within the university. I think there are signs of this. I think the way that say university professors and academic vice presidents are keen on having respectful campus policies, despite the effect they have on open and free inquiry and discussion, is one. Something that was, to my mind, revelatory was the Rebecca Tuval affair with Hypatia.
The philosophy.
Yeah, do you recall what happened there?
Was that the one where she not defended, but the logical argument was that transracialism can be defended?
Well, that's right. She said that the same reasons why we ought to not merely tolerate but warmly accept transsexuals applies also to transracials. So her view was that the same arguments in favor of openness to transsexuality and transsexuals that applies to transracialism and transracial people. And then she was, well, the journal Hypatia published this article after it went through the standard reviewing process. But some members of an advisory editorial board took exception to it and wrote an open letter criticizing Hypatia's choice to publish this, and some indeed calling for its retraction. There are facts here that I do want to get right, but I can't get them in my pull in my mind right now, because there were the two letters, and one was calling for the journal to pull the paper, and the other not so much. But at any rate, what was astonishing was hundreds, maybe into the thousands of signatures on one of these obnoxious letters, not claiming that grounds for retraction are typically things like academic fraud, that the data were made up, rather or
and those should be retracted. I mean, if it comes out that
or plagiarism, something like that. But this article committed no academic sins, and indeed was a very good article. I read it. I enjoyed it. I thought the argumentation was good. Perfectly respectable academic philosophical journal article. No two ways about it. There was nothing really to. I mean, you criticized the argument, but no grounds for thinking this was a piece of wrongful work, or shouldn't have been published, should have been turned down. And yet, many people came out saying, no, let's not criticize the argument for weaknesses or not considering something, but because we don't like the conclusion, or because the author is not herself Black or transsexual or transracial, and just the sheer number of people who, of university people who bought into that sort of line was, to my mind, scary. And so I think it indicated that there is something going on. There was the article by the political scientist as well, who argued mildly in favor of some of the, what he took to be some of the historical benefits of colonization, of European colonization, non-European areas, non-European peoples. And there were over 7,000 signatures on a letter calling for retraction. That I think is very worrisome.
That's it. It's concerning more so for me, because in philosophy, the one place that you would think, okay, if you have a bad argument, then all the philosophers are gonna destroy it. If you have a good argument, whether you agree with it or not, people will criticize it. But it was scary because it was in Hypatia. Is that how you say it? Hypatia?
Hypatia.
Hypatia. And Hypatia is one of the top feminist philosophy journals.
Well, it was. Maybe, I mean, Hypatia, the journal itself, handled it well. They got rid of all the associate editors and changed the...
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So unfortunately, the editor resigned after cleaning house a bit. Okay. And that's too bad. But the journal itself stood by the article, did not retract it, and got rid of the advisory board. So the journal did well. But I think submissions to it, to the journal, fell off. Yeah.
That's tough. And so you're a very strong proponent of free and open speech, dialogue.
Yeah.
Does that get you into trouble?
Well, I haven't received any pay cuts. What sort of trouble? I don't know. There are because some people at the university who don't talk to me, but that's okay.
Because I mean, you are.
I can that.
You're a very strong proponent of free speech.
Yeah,
and it's rare to find profs who are openly supportive of free speech. So and especially as someone who's the president of Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship. What is it that makes you support free speech to the extent that you do?
Well, I think it ties into respect for the individual as a autonomous agent, that is, as a thinking and valuing agent, one who can look at his or her beliefs and values and evaluate piecemeal, of course, not all at once. And that's the sort of ability that I admire. And so I want there to be places, I want society in general to be a place for these people and for the values of autonomous individualism. That's one. And I think there are a lot of professors who are not opposed to freedom of expression and support it in their, but they don't seem to be as appalled by the infringements and infringements on freedom of expression and threats to it as I am. And so that gets me worked up a bit, and so that's why I've joined groups and try to write letters and the rest. But many professors are don't mind hearing in their classrooms views with which they disagree and views that they may in fact think are pernicious. But they're not upset to learn that other professors will try to shut down discussion if the discussion wanders in ways that the professor doesn't like, or if certain values come up that rather than address those values critically, it's better to shame the person who espouses them to try to indicate to other people not to take up those values.
Which is so strange that you would do that. You know, you would think, because if you shame someone, even if you shame someone and they retract it in public, doesn't mean that they would retract it in private.
No, but it's also for the people around them, right? It's to create an atmosphere, to create an ethos where you want to be welcomed, and you know that if you don't espouse these values, you might not be welcome. And that can bring one sincerely to hold those values, and not merely pretend or sham that one does. So the shaming and call-out culture isn't entirely trying to reform the target person. It's to create an atmosphere for everyone, so that people come into the right attitudes and hold them sincerely, and not only pretend to have them.
So how free should one be to express their opinions and their views? Even like, to what extent should they be able to express them? Because not a criticism, but a point that's always made is, you should be tolerant of certain views, most views, until those views are racist or call for violence. I guess that's pretty bad. But there's the idea that, okay, you can be tolerant to a certain point, and then there's hate speech, the Ontario College, I believe, where they wrote that that document defending free speech because of the Ford government, where they said, we support free speech is good, but until it's hate speech, then so there's this hate speech that we support free speech, but then when it comes to hate speech, we don't longer support it.
Well, hate speech is, to my mind, an unfortunate category. It should not be recognized in law as a category.
Okay.
We should be free to speak our hatreds, and be criticized and be corrected. If you have a view about people that's unflattering to those people, well, speak it and be corrected and learn. Universities, I mean, talk about hate speech laws in Canada. In Canada, an act of the police don't go around looking for hateful speech. There has to be a complaint. Someone has to complain. Now, what I would say is that, university people just don't complain. If someone is saying something that you think is false, then present them with evidence, or present the crowd with evidence, other people as well, that it is false. If it's pernicious, then argue that these views or values are pernicious. There's no need to take it to the police. And when universities say they're on the side of free speech up to hate speech, well, they shouldn't include that. Just ignore it. It's a matter for the police and the courts. It's not, the universities needn't take on a role policing speech. Even if there are, in Canada, hate speech is covered in both the criminal code and by human rights commissions and human rights tribunals, but leave it to them. If our universities were populated mainly by scholars, no one would be summoning anyone. The concept of hate speech just wouldn't get any traction.
So within the university, hate speech should just be treated as another, hate speech in quotes should be treated as another idea that can be challenged and put down if it's false.
Sure, when someone's speaking hatefully, they're presenting views, and our task is to take those views and write them down on the blackboard and say, well, what are the arguments for, and what are the arguments against, and what are the objections to the arguments for, and what are the objections to the arguments against, and how does it fit with these other things? And Stanley Fish's term is academicize.
Academicize?
Yes, always academicize.
You mean, does that mean academicize any idea?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So ignore everything except the idea or the expression of the value, and examine it critically. If that's what the class is assembled to do, otherwise just ignore it and move on to whatever the actual topic is. You can address it privately in conversation later if you want. Yeah, and I'm talking about things that actually are racist or sexist or homophobic, because I know those terms get thrown around a lot, and there are views that really aren't racist in any sense I understand. They might be false, they might be pernicious, but why bother characterizing them as racist? Just take the thesis, whatever it is, and ask what are the reasons for thinking it true, what are the reasons for thinking it false. One of the problems with things like hate speech laws is that it diverts our attention. So instead of taking what is said as a thesis or the espousal of some value and examining it that way, we now say, well, has it crossed the line? Right. So now we're not debating the idea itself. We're debating something like the hatefulness or social acceptability or whatever of the idea. And that's getting away from what we should be doing, which is talking about the things themselves and not whether some instance of espousing some view falls into a category or not.
So it's okay to criticize the view so long as you're not trying to curb the view from being espoused.
Well, yeah, I mean, if people discover that the view is false, they're not going to espouse it anymore. No, your task is just that academic task of evaluating the ideas, of trying to understand the ideas, trying to see what resonances they have with other ideas, and ultimately trying to determine whether the idea is true or false, whether it's well evidenced or poorly evidenced. Likewise, whether the value is sound or unsound.
The atmosphere at universities, though, it certainly doesn't feel that way. It feels more like, okay, there are certain views that you cannot say or even jokingly say.
Right.
And is there, okay, so for a good example, in your critical thinking class, do you make an effort to tell your students, okay, guys, arguments are the most important. You can espouse whatever you want to espouse. Give me a good argument. Or like, how do you go about getting your students to hold the importance of liberal studies?
Well, I don't, and I can't, because that would be imposing.
Really?
Yes. No, my classrooms are an invitation to try out ways of thinking, ways of
thinking.
Yeah, ways of thinking, ways of orienting oneself towards the world. Come try it out, see if it fits. If you like it, great. If not, don't bother with it anymore. So no, I don't want to convince anyone of anything. Certainly not the rectitude of my values or the rightness of my my way. It's just, here we are gathered in this university classroom. I assume everyone here is here of their own free will, that no one has been coerced into coming.
Right.
What we're going to do is we're going to discuss topics of some controversy. And we're going to do it by analyzing the ideas and the arguments and suggesting ways of criticizing them, altering them. And people can play along and acquire these skills or not, as they wish. And maybe they play along, acquire these skills, and then decide that they don't want to be like this after all.
Right.
So,
it seems like a very optimistic view of student culture.
How so? Optimistic?
Optimistic in the sense that you think that most students are coming in with the idea of, not having their ideas challenged. Whereas from my experience, it seems like most students are there to not have their ideas challenged. Precisely that they're kind of in there in school, And then when they do have their ideas challenged, there's a, say there's a report.
Mm-hmm.
And we know this, I think there was that English literature prof recently was reading a historic book, and in it, the N-word was in it. And then he he read that, he read that section, and then a bunch of his students complained. And then the next class, he had students who weren't even in his class. In his class, and then they asked him to leave the class. So I mean, like, I'm sure he was being very optimistic and thinking, okay, these students are here to learn. They're not going to be. I mean, I'm sure they might be offended if I say this, but it's a historic book. They're not going to get offended. So in that sense of optimism, it seems like you have the same optimism.
Well, and also, do remember, intellectuals are never offended. You are never offended. You can't be offended because everything is just a thesis to be examined. Suppose there's someone says something with which you roundly disagree. Now, to take offense at it is I mean, it's first of all, it's a secondhand emotion. I mean, we're not offended at atrocities. I mean, we're upset by them and angered. So that's reacting to the thing itself. What we're offended by is someone's view about something. I'm offended that you have that view about this thing. You should be upset by it, and you're not. And you're not being upset offends me. But of course, the intellectual doesn't do that. The intellectual's interest. Oh, you're not upset by this. Well, what are your values? And so we investigate one's identity by holding it at arm's length and examining it. So I think that if people at a university are ever feeling offense, then the ethos at that university is not as secure as it should be.
Okay.
Students, and again, it's their choice to try to be intellectuals or not. But if they are at the university and they're invited to react to things as intellectuals do, then they don't feel offended by anything. Either the view that otherwise would offend them is correct and they should go over to it, or it's false and they have reasons for rejecting it. So where does offense come in?
Right.
One's offended only if there's something like trying to mold people's attitudes through social pressures and not through evidence and argument.
The idea that intellectuals should not be offended.
Well, they won't be.
They won't be. But that's not true, though, because a lot of all those professors who signed the letter against Rebecca Tuvel.
Well, they're not intellectuals.
Okay. Okay, so it's a.
You're right. The should would be. I mean, we have a good number of values and inclinations and preferences, and sometimes they don't sit together all that well. And so while we're keen on encountering the world as intellectuals, sometimes we fail to do so and something offends us. And to the extent that we would rather be encountering the world as intellectuals than not, then we shouldn't be offended.
Right.
But if one is engaged as an intellectual, then one is not going to be offended.
Yeah. No, that is a good point to end on, to be an intellectual. But Mark, thanks so much.
6 o'clock.
Yeah, it's been an hour. I think it's been an hour. Yeah. Thanks so much for taking your time to talk with me.
Well, you're welcome.
And I hope we can do this again soon.
Yes, we can. We'll talk about the culture of disputation and the culture of celebration. We didn't even get to that.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Mark.
Okay. You take care, IJ.